When people have asked me what my favorite console of all time is, the answer varies a little bit depending on when exactly you ask me. I go in waves, but one system that consistently I gotta go with is the PS2. The library on that system is just truly incredible, not to mention the backwards compatibility with an amazing catalog of PS1 titles. It's just one of my favorite systems to play. And in fact, of my older consoles, it's actually the one that I'm actively hooking up and using more often. Now, while I could just take the system as is and hook it up to a modern display, and hopefully it might work depending on what TV I'm using, there's actually a lot of ways to integrate it into modern setups that's going to enhance the experience a lot. Obviously, there's also the choice of just using it with an old school CRT, which is a unique experience that I do love, but at the same time, I really like being able to incorporate it into just my main TV setup. And the first, arguably most important aspect of this is how I hook it up to my modern TV. And in my case, I'm making use of what's known as the RetroTink 5X Pro. If you have not heard of this before, it is a specialty upscaler designed specifically for gaming in mind. It's released in small batches, and it is not particularly cheap, but it does allow for a truly incredible experience of using old school systems with modern displays. And really, one of the things I appreciate the most about it is that compared to a lot of other options, is that it's really easy to incorporate. It's not a mod, it's not something where you have to do anything to the system itself, you don't have to do any soldering, you don't have to replace anything. It really is just an upscaler where all you do is take your system, plug it into one of the inputs of the RetroTink, take HDMI out, plug it into your TV, and you're good to go. There is some complexity that comes with actively using the RetroTink and getting the most out of it, but as far as just integrating it into a setup goes, super simple. While the RetroTink can make use of just a basic composite cables that would have come with a PS2 standard, it's not necessarily the best way to go about. Ultimately, if you want to get the best looking image possible, it's important to use good cables going into the RetroTink as well. And in my case, I am making use of component cables. Technically, the ones I'm using were actually released and marketed for the PS3, but it's the same output as what the PS2 has, so I'm able to use them there. Another set of cables that I've used in the past that I've had a really good experience with are the Retrovision HD cables for the PS2. Those are actually the cables I use at home, while this component one is what I'm using here at the office. Once it's all hooked up, there are a myriad of settings for you to go through, whether that's adjusting what output resolution you want the RetroTink setting out, whether you want to make use of scan lines, adjusting sharpness, color options. There's a lot going on, and if you've never really used something like this before and haven't really studied, how to get the best looking image out of older systems, it can be a little overwhelming at first. Thankfully, there are some preloaded profiles you can choose from, which take a lot of the initial work out, and then you can kind of experiment from there to tweak the image to your personal preference. Me personally, this is something that I'm still actively learning and trying to get more knowledgeable about, and so part of what I've been doing right now is I've been researching a lot of different guides and using their suggested settings, which even then, you still want to adjust a little bit on a game-by-game basis, because depending on the graphical style of the game you're playing, if you're playing a PS1 game versus a PS2 game, playing a PS2 game that had 16:9 natively versus one that only does 4:3, there's a lot of different settings you can adjust to really get the image at the right crispness level that just looks really nice. It takes a little bit of work and some experimentation, but once you put the time into it, it is just amazing looking. Like I mentioned at the start of this video, there is of course something about playing old school hardware on a CRT that is very difficult to replicate, but as far as getting as close to that experience as possible with a modern display, the RetroTink has really enabled me to do that. It really helps too that as part of incorporating the setup, I'm using the LGC one, which has been my main go-to for a gaming TV. It just has a couple other extra settings and things that when paired with the RetroTink actually works out pretty nicely. In particular, a relatively new feature that got added in a recent update is black frame insertion, which basically when you're playing 60 FPS games is a method to help tone down the latency even further so it gets closer to that kind of responsiveness that you're used to on an old school CRT. The PS2 is not the only system I've been using the RetroTink with. It's been great for a lot of other retro consoles, but again, PS2 is really the oldest system that I hook up very consistently. There's just a lot in that library that I really love, and it's been a great addition to my setup to get the most out of it. I will also say the RetroTink 5X Pro is not the only way to accomplish this goal. There are a number of different upscalers out there that are focused on this purpose with varying degrees of success. Really, if you're even just looking for a super cheap solution, there's other things out there like Hyperkin's HDMI cables that is not going to come close to the same quality of what this thing does, but if you're just looking for a get the job done kind of situation for the cheapest price possible, it's gonna do that. That said, if you do want to have one of the best experiences possible and really get something that's going to both look good and get close to that experience of using it on older hardware, the RetroTink definitely does that much better. Now, while video is an extremely important component of all of this, something else though that I think is worth mentioning is also audio. And for the PS2 in particular, something that's really important to point out and make use of is the optical output. This is actually something about the PS2 that was a bit ahead of its time. Obviously, the tech existed and was there, but it really wasn't something that a lot of regular home consumers weren't going to be taking advantage of. It was really just the most dedicated of home theater enthusiasts that were embracing that back in the PS2's time, and then it got a lot more time to shine during the PS3 and early years of the PS4. But what's amazing about it being on a system as old as the PS2 is that you can still make use of it today. Now, you could incorporate that as part of a home theater setup, but one of the ways that I've been using it recently that I think is really cool is using it with a modern headset. Though there is a little bit of fine print to this. You have to specifically be using a wireless headset that has its own dedicated transmitter that accepts optical out, which is something that's becoming a little rarer, I've been noticing, in more recent gaming headsets because a lot of the current systems, like the PS5 and Xbox Series systems, don't incorporate optical out anymore, but there are ones you could find. In my personal case right now, I'm actually using an older headset of mine, which is the SteelSeries Arctis Pro. It's actually one that I think is discontinued and they're not actively selling anymore. So if you're interested in trying something like this, I'll list a couple other options down below that do have that port and are currently available. But the point is you're able to just take an optical cable, take it in the optical out of the PS2, plug it into the transmitter, hook it up to power, and bam, you're using a modern, nice headset with the PS2. Not only that though, but using the optical out instead of relying on, the audio that's coming from the AV output is going to result in a cleaner, nicer sounding audio than you would normally have. I'll be honest, 90% of the time I'm still relying on just the built-in TV speakers, but when I want to really get immersed in something, this is a really interesting option for the PS2. One other thing that really ties this whole experience together is what controller you're using for the game, because, that is your main way of really directly interacting with it. And while there's a part of me that still enjoys occasionally using the original DualShock 2 because, that's the way I played them back in the day, it's not always actually the most comfortable option, especially compared to how a lot of controllers today are now designed. And a recently released option that I had sent out to me and I got to try out and I've really been enjoying and has now become my main controller for the PS2 is the Defender controller from Retro Fighters. This is a wireless controller that's designed primarily for PlayStation in mind, although it can also be used on PC or even with the Nintendo Switch. Basically, it's a wireless controller that comes with a pair of dongles you can use, one that's USB, so if you want to use that with PC, or with a PlayStation style controller input, so you can use that with a PS1 or PS2. And that's really the main instance that I've been messing with the controller with, and it's been a great experience. Obviously, just looking at the design of the Defender, it is much more in line with how a lot of modern controllers are designed. It's very similar to the DualSense in a lot of ways. I actually think the grip shape is a little closer to how Xbox controllers are designed, but of course, being something designed with PlayStation in mind, it does have symmetrical sticks rather than offset. I'm not going to necessarily say that it's like my favorite controller of all time or anything, but as far as a replacement and upgrade for the DualShock 2 is really nice. The simplicity of actually having a wireless setup instead of still relying on a cable, the grip shape is a lot more comfortable, buttons feel crisp, it's got a solid D-pad, and depending on the kind of games you're playing, it does also have actual triggers rather than the R2, L2 buttons that the DualShock 2 originally had. Also, despite the fact that it's a color design that PlayStation hasn't actually used a ton in a lot of their official hardware, I always really love that see-through dark blue that some of their stuff has had, which the Defender is available in and is immediately my favorite choice. So they do have some other ones that match a little more traditional if you want something that looks like it'd be paired with an old system, like a regular matte black or gray. Also, being an unlicensed third-party controller, it of course has a turbo feature, which for a retro-intended controller just feels really right to me. I mean, that was such a common, standard thing to see on third-party controllers back in the day that having it in a modern option that works on an old system just feels right. These three combined really make for an updated PS2 experience that works great in modern setups and just has a convenience factor that I really appreciate. Again, specifically the RetroTink, but also applying to everything else I talked about, nothing requires any kind of fancy modifications, there's not any kind of extra legwork that's involved. All of these are plug-in-and-play solutions that are really straightforward and simple. And to be honest, it's actually been getting some extra use lately because since the release of PlayStation Premium, I was really excited to see a lot of older games make their way to modern systems, and the rollout's been kind of slower than I was hoping it would be. There are a couple games that I'm really glad are on there, but there's a lot more that's missing. So much so that I've just been going back and replaying some PS1 and PS2 classics that are either ones that I never got around to finishing and now might be finally the time, or they're just ones that I really like and wanted to jump back in again. And really, I hope Premium someday expands its library to the point to where you don't necessarily have to go out of your way to do things like this, but until they do, this has just been a great solution to play a bunch of my classic favorites. If you're interested in doing anything similar to the kind of stuff I've been talking about, I've got everything I've used linked down below, or at least things that are similar and are options that you can make use of. As always, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button to let me know, or dislike if you didn't. It's always good info for me to have. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you guys later.